Hey, we're here for Neon Liberalism episode number 7. I'm Jason Brigham. With me, as always, Samantha Hancox-Lee. Today we have, as a guest, a contributing editor to Liberal Currents, Liberal Currents being the website that hosts this podcast. Matthew Downhour is with us, and we're going to be talking about the Syrian civil war, a daunting, complex, borderline insane topic. And a horrible topic, obviously, but one vital in recent world news and recent world history. And Samantha, the civil war in Syria has gone on more than a decade. It's involved numerous parties. It is not a two-sided conflict. It is a conflict that very well described as a proxy war in addition to a civil war. Can you maybe help our listeners in some sense, understand a little bit of what has gone on in what is an impossibly complex situation?
Yeah, sure. As you say, the Syrian civil war is extremely complicated. I am not going to try and explain everything about it, but it's actually a little simpler to describe now because we know who won it, which happened quite recently. In fact, we had hoped to talk about it a few weeks ago when it happened, but also there was a coup in South Korea, and that kind of took over our brain space for a while. There's a lot of history happening these days, certainly a lot of history in Syria. And I think it's really an interesting topic because both it's, a military event, somebody won a war in a very dramatic fashion, but it also reveals some, I think, deeper features of politics and political systems that we like to talk about here on neoliberalism. But before we get to all that, the Syrian civil war effectively is part of the Arab Spring, series of protest movements that sweep across the Arab world in 2011. I know, feels like yesterday, but
Yeah, I was going to say the Arab Spring. I haven't heard that name in a long time.
all across the Arab world, a lot of dictatorships, the people turn out into the streets, they're chanting, the people want to bring down the regime, for good reasons. That itself is its own topic. In Syria, this rapidly turns into a civil war where the dictator Bashar al-Assad, his family has ruled the country since the 1970s, basically does not accede to any of the protesters' demands. His response is repression and murder. We're not going to give an inch. The war kicks off in earnest, and like you say, just keeps getting more complicated. Syria is a very diverse nation with a lot of different religious groups, a lot of different ethnic groups. And on top of that, it has a lot of neighbors who are interested in intervening in Syrian politics. So there are Iranian-backed groups, there are Turkish-backed groups, there are American-backed groups, there are Russian-backed groups. For a while, the Islamic State, another blast from the past year, had operations in Syria, and this is part of the complicated story is that the the man who eventually wins or is in charge of winning the civil war, his name is Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, or that was a nom de guerre he was using while he was a member of Al-Qaeda, and then later affiliated with the Islamic State, and then later he breaks with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. The American, military analysis community doesn't think this break is real, but it probably was. They kill each other a bunch. He goes through more changes. The groups he's affiliated with go through more changes. Eventually, he's in charge, or the military, whatever, the leader of a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. And they kind of consolidate one area of the Syrian resistance. Um, and recently, in incredibly dramatic fashion, steamrolled the remainder of the regime forces and won.
Yeah, it seems like that there was a period of several years where they were in their region, and things had quieted down. And in 2023, U.S. intelligence basically was saying that they thought Assad's regime was pretty much in charge of much of the country, and that things had almost stabilized.
The Gulf states that had been backing a lot of the resistance to the regime seems to have sort of given up. They had started to normalize with the Assad regime as if, they saw no way out of this war except to just accept that Assad would continue ruling. That's part of what made it such a shock when that turned out to be incorrect.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's, again, what's so militarily, politically surprising is just that the conflict seemed unsolvable and frozen, and like maybe Assad was finally winning the decade-long endurance match with the rebels. And then that very much turned out to not be the case, which is kind of what the puzzle I think we were trying to talk about here today. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's enough of a timeline of the war just to give people a sense of what happened.
No, and so al-Jilani is now going by a new name and trying to project a new image and probably a new reality too, trying to, project an image of taking over the government and ruling in a serious manner and that sort of thing. His new name is Ahmed al-Shara.
Well, my understanding is that's not his new name. That's his real
it's
name.
original name. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, al-Jilani was the war name
yes,
he used, and now he's back to...
He's gone back, yeah, correct.
And just for recent history, the dates we're talking about here, essentially what the Aleppo offensive starts, what was that, like November 30th, November 29th, something like that?
Something like that.
And then December 8th, I believe, was sort of the official end. Assad gets on the plane, and that's the end of his regime. So we're talking about a period of like maybe 10 days, as I recall. And I should be able to recall better because this is very recent. But it also happened so very quickly that it was difficult to keep up with as it was happening. Major cities following every day.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess that comes to the one of the first things I want to talk about here is like the military side of things, and like what happened and how did the rebels win this war that everyone thought they had lost? And I mean, my view on the subject that I think applies here is there's a concept in military theory that there's a contrast between positional warfare and maneuver warfare, right? And positional warfare is kind of historical warfare. You see a lot of it, where you're going to get your army and you're going to point it at the enemy's army, and they're all going to kind of line up and slug it out, and whoever gets tired first loses. Like the most famous example of this that probably people know about is World War I on the Western Front, where there's particular, like the trenches, these battle lines that never move. It's just an endless meat grinder that people are feeding blood and bullets into, and eventually somebody runs out of blood, so to speak. So that's, I don't know, positional warfare. Positional warfare obviously sucks to do because it's enormously expensive in terms of the human cost of it. And so this is kind of why this concept of maneuver warfare is developed. And the idea of maneuver warfare is modern combined arms maneuver warfare is that instead of just standing there and slugging it out, you're going to maneuver on the battlefield in ways, and to do it not just to move once and like make one little tactical move, but to like keep on doing it. That your group is going to be acting so faster than the enemy can really respond to. Different things are going to start going wrong for them in different places that is beyond their capacity to adapt to, and it's going to lead to a systemic collapse in their overall military structure. And so like one of the probably a familiar case here are the two wars in Iraq, the Persian Gulf or whatever, what is it? Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, where the American military, has this very move fast and break things approach to warfare, where it's just, we are going to be attacking the enemy everywhere. We are going to be moving as fast as possible. We're going to be blowing up stuff everywhere we can find it. We don't want a fixed battle line, right? And it's going to, make it just move too fast for a slow army to respond to on a cognitive and decision-making level, and then everything just kind of breaks down and you win. That's a very brief summary of what maneuver warfare is supposed to do.
In a sense, that's when Americans think of warfare, I think that is what we think of, because that's the only sort of war the U.S. really tolerates. The U.S. hasn't been involved in an attritional war for a very long time, probably since Vietnam. And so, when we imagine, when we go to war, that's the only kind that we expect to fight. And arguably anything else at this point to be politically impossible. That's one of the big questions, right? Politically, an attritional warfare takes a toll that you hope a rapid maneuver war doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has been kind of the concept of maneuver warfare, historically speaking. It's developed by the Prussians, who always viewed themselves as having a pretty precarious strategic situation where they were faced by enemies on all sides, including an extremely large enemy in the form of Russia, that, they could never hope to win a pure attritional warfare against all of their enemies everywhere. So they had this idea, right? We're going to do maneuver warfare, Bewegungskrieg for the people who like their technical terms here.
Yeah, I think part of the reason it emerges at that time is there's become this enormous increase in the ability of armies to deploy ammunition at each other, right? And so the very, very, very long ago style of lining up your army and marching forward, well, you just get mowed down in this modern era of these incredible machine guns and like high-powered artillery and things like this. And so the response that was, innovated, around World War I, like you mentioned, like, when they're dealing with this catastrophic trench warfare, and like, out of that comes this sort of emerging, like, when we as Americans think of recent wars, you think of this like the sort of haphazard advance. Everyone's like, take cover, give me cover, and this is the emergence of this sort of modern system of warfare. I like to try to deal with this like overwhelming firepower, is that you always have to be taking cover and take whatever cover you can. And your high powered weaponry, whether that's the planes or the artillery, are like occasionally providing this suppressive fire to like, cover me as I move forward, and like that's like this new modern system of warfare. You're not marching the whole army forward in a field. You have these like sort of independent units, and they're coordinating with their air power and their artillery, and they're just sort of haphazardly advancing. And that brings in this element of motion and surprise that you're talking about that makes it so effective, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is like the idea of maneuver warfare, like you say, it's in part a response to a series of technological developments. The firepower revolution that just enormously increases the lethality of basically every weapon on the battlefield, but also the transportation revolutions. Starts with the railroad, and then later trucks, tanks, etc. All these things that let you move large numbers of people much, much faster than a walk. And the other key component here is the communications revolution. Right, again, initially telegraphed communications and then later radios that enable you to coordinate these groups as they're moving fast and breaking things, that you can all kind of stay in contact and not just become a total mess, frankly.
So to bring this over to Syria, I'm wondering if, Samantha, I'm wondering if your hypothesis is that in their years in this controlling this one region of Syria, if the ultimately successful rebels just trained and drilled and got coordinated with each other very well and developed trust with each other and figured out how they were going to carry out these maneuvers.
Yeah, so there's a book out on the subject that I like called Military Power by Stephen Biddle.
Yeah, there you go.
And Biddle's argument is that these kinds of warfare, it's not just a technical question. Right, because one of them is probably better. So why doesn't everybody just do it? Right, that's like, yeah, why isn't everybody doing this all the time? And Biddle's answer is that these are a response to technical changes, but also to social changes. That militaries are in some ways a mirror of their societies. And this kind of modern maneuver warfare really requires a lot of trust, right? Right, if you were in a Greek hoplite formation, you were literally shoulder to shoulder with everybody else in the entire army, and you all knew each other.
Yeah.
Right? You were like either personally or familially, or just to see them around the street on your city state, like so your city state in arms, all together, like within visual range of each other.
Mm.
And you can't do that in the modern warfare, right? Because somebody will drop artillery on your head and you'll all die. Right. So you are this enormously dispersed operation where there's only a few people next to you, but there's enormous army kind of over the hills and over the horizon. And you need to know that they're all doing their part because you're risking your life out there on the assumption that everybody else is also doing their utmost and doing things well. And that, if you call in artillery, they'll like the guys running the artillery who you've never met and whose names you may never know, like actually can do it all correctly and like drop artillery on the enemy when you need them to. And so to do effective maneuver warfare, you need a society where people trust each other, where they are willing to.
You're willing to put your life on the understanding that somebody else is going to do their job exactly as planned, right? Like you're going to make an advance from which there is no return unless the next two, brigades over whatever also are doing exactly what they said they're going to do.
Yeah,
That's right.
and you're going to consistently believe in something that you can't see. The Samantha referred to the old formations. You just look to your left and look to your right, and everyone's there doing their part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're relying on your radio and the chain of command and all these things that are more abstract.
Yeah, and so there's been a suggestion, for example, that this kind of explains why Russia hasn't been able to win in Ukraine, right? That Russia has certainly an enormous resource advantage over Ukraine, right? Both in terms of the human resources, industrial resources, enormous Soviet stockpiles of equipment, all the gear, all the, fighter jets and, supersonic bombers and precision missiles and all the stuff that a modern military is supposed to have. And yet they're stuck in trench warfare in Ukraine, that they weren't able to just run over the country in a matter of weeks the way we did in Iraq, because there's this lack of trust in Russian society, right? You read about the way conscripts are spent at the front, in meat wave assaults. This is not a system that is conducive, again, in very hierarchical, like top-down command and control structures. This is not a military system that is suited to these kinds of like very rapid devolution of independence to the lower command kind of warfare.
Also wonder, when you, for example, compare what HTS is able to do in Syria when it was essentially undergunned and had fewer resources versus Russia and Ukraine, what the level of trust in the defending society has to do with it. And when you look at Syria, one thing that happened was as soon as things started to turn against the Syrian Arab army, the Assad's army, it did seem like there was a huge breakdown in trust and in loyalty of the civilians, behind the army.
Yes.
Were before HTS even arrived, were sort of pledging allegiance to it. That immediate breakdown of trust, which Russia really tried maneuver warfare in Ukraine and actually had some successes right in February and early March. But when they ran into a major city, besides Kherson, but when they ran into Mykolaiv or Kharkiv or Kiev, there wasn't the collapse that we associate with maneuver warfare. There wasn't, the fall of Baghdad and Basra and these things that when the U.S. does it, we expect to happen so quickly. And it doesn't seem like it was for lack of firepower necessarily, because HTS did it with technicals and RPGs, but because they're running up against a society that was maybe not as susceptible to that kind of warfare that, like you said, really depends on breaking down the enemy's decision-making and their cohesion. Certainly you can damage that, but a determined enough opponent perhaps presents more troubles to maneuver warfare than the U.S. has necessarily encountered.
Yeah, so there's been some incredible videos out of the collapse of the Syrian regime where like you say, HTS forces, a couple of guys in technicals, a pickup truck with a machine gun strapped to it, and maybe an RPG in the back, are driving towards an entrenched position of Assad's forces, and the Assad's forces just break down and run. Right? Guys pile out of this building and try to get away, and someone else jumps out of this building and runs for their truck, and then a tank comes out of a garage at the other end of the city, and it's a tank, right? There's no way that a technical is ever going to defeat a tank. And the tank hits its smoke generators and guns it for the horizon, right? Because there's just this total breakdown of cohesion among Assad's forces. And at the same time, the HTS people are willing to get in their technical and drive towards the enemy position, knowing like, oh yeah, maybe we've got drone support, right? Maybe someone whose name I don't know and I've never met, or maybe I have met, whatever, it doesn't really matter, right? There's a drone operator back there who's got a little suicide drone who's like waiting to see if a tank does show up and come after us, and maybe we can do something about that, right? There's a cohesion of the HTS forces, and not just HTS, right? This is Assad's regime collapses basically because so many different rebel groups all actually get together and start going at them all at the same time, that over the years of the Civil War, al-Jawlani was able, al-Jawlani, HTS, broadly speaking, was able to build a level of trust from other rebel groups, right? That they would participate in this offensive and not be worried that like as soon as HTS gets here, they're going to kill us. So like maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah, and that's going to be, I mean, we'll get to that later, but that will be one of the big questions is to what extent can some of those other groups be incorporated into a national military, or will they remain somewhat separate, or will there, you said the war was over. It's maybe better say it's over for now, right? It remains to be seen the extent to which there can be some cohesion there. But the diplomatic success in getting those extremely different groups, from largely Kurdish, almost ethnic militaries, not precisely ethno-nationalist, but very ethnically based militias, to religious militias like HTS, to just various rebel groups to work together and not immediately at least start fighting each other, at least until the primary job was over. Also something that was a reason the regime lasted as long as it did, because that hadn't been the case. These groups would spend as much time fighting each other as the regime for most of the conflict.
That's right. I mean, that speaks to the ways that Assad functionally used divide and rule tactics to control the country, right? That every minority group was afraid, well, if somebody else comes into power, they're going to take the turn to wear the boot and start oppressing us. So no one can really, not like the opposition can never get together enough to defeat Assad. The other thing I actually do want to talk about on the military side of things is the role of, the proxy war aspect of all of this, and the role of foreign support. So one argument that gets made, by Phillips, Pace, and O'Brien is that maneuver warfare basically in the modern world depends on air superiority. If you don't have air superiority, you just can't do it because somebody is going to show up and, airmail high explosives to you and you're not going to like it. And that for a long time, Assad's forces could be a mess on the ground, but he had Russian support. Right. And the Russians were always happy to deliver enormous amounts of artillery or bombs, basically, to his enemies just to keep Syria, their ally, in operation. Assad also had backing from Iran. In recent years, you may have heard that both Iran and Russia have been tied up in other wars in other places. And so one argument that gets made is that part of HTS's success is based on just the collapse of, or the unavailability of foreign military support for Assad's regime.
Yes. Well, and I'd be curious what your take on that is, because one thing that you did notice in those 10 days, or however long it lasted, was a high level of airstrikes on the city of Aleppo after it was captured, on the city of Idlib before, but not the sort of strikes that you would expect to try to blunt positional warfare that's going to take over your capital in 10 days, or maneuver warfare. But what I mean is, it seemed like, anyway, whoever was operating the Air Force either didn't have the precision or the intelligence to actually be doing the sort of close air support that we, I guess, associate with defending against, or what O'Brien would say, like, here's the problem, right? Your tanks get smoked by helicopters, whatever. We saw a pretty high intensity air campaign, but it was focused on these urban centers where targeting is going to be difficult, and it doesn't seem like it's really hitting the front line where you're actually in the most danger. I mean, was that the impression you got as you watched things unfold? That's sort of what it seemed like to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. That air power, it's not just about having, this whole modern system is that it's not just about having a plane that can put a bomb somewhere, right? But like be able to deliver firepower in a precise way to where it's useful. And that requires an intelligence, what they call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance apparatus, to like identify like where is the enemy. and the right kind of command and control structure to like take that information and pass it to the right people, and then to have the actual technical capabilities to put, ordnance on target. And that's something that, at some point Russia could have provided. It seems like Assad's capacities to do this domestically had just really, really atrophied if they ever existed.
So I want to ask about this idea that Syrian civil society was not supportive of the existing government, of course, or maybe not of course, but obviously in the midst of the civil war, so much resistance to the Assad regime. Um, and it sort of, leads to the question of how do they get to this place where they're led by a government that is so untrusted or unsupported by the society, right? People have suggested a lot of reasons for why Assad was able to maintain power. Among those, the idea that Syria, in some sense, there were ways that Assad managed to produce the revenue or wealth that maintained the government in ways that didn't necessarily require the support or economic success of the society as a whole. Samantha, did you want to talk about that? I think the notion of Syria as a narco state is something you've been wondering about.
A narco state, exactly. Again, this is, I mean, if the Syrian civil war, very complicated, maybe you don't know this if you don't follow it. Syria was especially Assad's regime specifically, was a major exporter of a drug called Captagon. It's basically a synthetic amphetamine. Whatever, we don't need to talk too much about the pharmacology. It's not very popular in the United States, but it was very popular across the Arab world, in the Gulf states. And during the civil war, more and more, Assad's regime turns to producing Captagon and selling it to various other Arab states in order to finance the regime. Right? And I mean, we're not talking a small trade here. Right, this is enough to support a national government kind of a trade in drugs. And so, yeah, they absolutely were a narco state in certain respects.
Which is interesting because it's not a totally new strategy, but I feel like anyway, it's when we associate with insurgencies or rebel groups, right? That this turning to illicit drugs specifically as a revenue mechanism has a relatively long history in the 20th century, I guess, but it's usually not a state actor that turns to that. Is that an accurate impression?
No, that's exactly right. It's on some level, it's because, it's not it's the thing that you do if you can't effectively administer a modern state. A modern state is going to be way more productive, basically, especially when the size of Syria, than a drug cartel. But if you can't effectively administer your own state, then you turn to these other sources of revenue. And what's interesting, and I think, Jason, you were kind of hinting at this, is the way these processes feed back into one another, right? So basically that as, you're having a tough time, taxing the people, administering a state. Okay, we can supplement that with drug revenues, and then we don't need to provide services as much. And then, we can just, turn more and more to drugs. And then the government services break down more and more because you don't need them, right? This is a concept from Bruno de Mesquita and others, the selectorate theory of politics, which basically says that, like, if you're a ruler of a country, or ruler of anything really, your selectorate is the group of people that you absolutely need to like keep satisfied in order to stay in power. And as you turn, and basically what this means is that if you have a really broad selectorate, you need to like have a functioning society, right, to keep that many people happy. And so it kind of promotes good government. But as your selectorate starts getting smaller and smaller, you don't need to attend to the needs of the people, so you stop, right? And as in Syria, the selectorate just keeps getting smaller, and it's like, well, we need to keep, the drug producers happy, and we need to keep the men with guns happy, and that's it. That's all we really need to do.
And then by contrast, that you see quite the opposite happening in northwest Syria, where HTS and the sort of civil arm, the Syrian Salvation Government, is operating. They have a couple of advantages. One is, they're smaller, and so they do have more kind of immediate trust. They're only ruling about 1 million people. But they seem to be more successful in, as you put it, sort of broadening their selectorate, where most parties, most groups in their area of control were at least, at least accepted that that was the government that was going to rule over them, and they in turn were delivering some infrastructure improvements, certainly some law and order improvements compared to what had not only under Assad but previous rebel pseudo governments. A big improvement there, at least as far as the very basic things, predictability of the law, a property protection system that at least is going to be accepted by most landowners and others in the area. Things like that, which I think sort of escaped notice from a military perspective, and maybe is what a lot of people weren't catching about the evolution of the situation in Syria when they said, it's just a stalemate. In civil society, you had two regions going in very different directions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. That, like you say, HTS very explicitly prioritized not just winning the war, but like just delivering basic good government to the people, right? Like you say, a legal system that you can rely on. So you know, do I own my house or not? Or who does? And who do I need to pay if I want to own that house, right? Delivering the basics of law and order that we kind of take for granted here. And obviously, it's very hard to measure any of this stuff reliably to get any kind of accurate statistics, but you can use proxies for economic growth, like, the nighttime luminosity of an area. It turns out is, well, somewhat, correlated with the overall economic development of that area for kind of obvious reasons. And we can measure that from space. You don't actually need census takers going out on the ground. And what you see is that when the civil war starts, the rebel areas are much than the regime areas, and for various reasons. And over time, the rebel areas get richer and the regime areas get poorer, right? That whatever HTS is delivering is effective. And this is it's a slow process. It's not something that's obvious because you can't watch a video of a bomb going off, when or whatever. You can't watch the analog of a video of a bomb going off. There's no snappy imagery of good government. But over time, it has a real effect. And certainly we've seen that in Syria.
I'd be curious, do you happen to know? So, of course, the northeast of Syria, across the Euphrates River, was sort of also not controlled by the Assad regime, but sort of in a détente with the Syrian government. Do you happen to know by those measures, what was happening there? We're looking at Raqqa. We're looking at the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they call themselves. Do we know anything about what their civil society looks like from those same measures?
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that.
I'd be curious. It'd be an interesting thing to look at, right? Because that is, when we look at the future of Syria, one of the questions will be okay, it's essentially been 3 countries or more, but essentially 3. How do they reincorporate that final section that really hasn't been ruled from Damascus? I don't know, since the Islamic State was defeated. That's been a mostly independent, although not officially independent region.
Yeah, so I think this kind of gets to, well, I guess we're transitioning away from why did the Assad regime kind of break down? Why did good government and social trust break down? And how did this ultimately infected their military in a pretty pervasive way? At the same time, the rebels are going in the other direction. And I think part of that story is the evolution. I mean, you can kind of track it in the ideological evolution of Ahmed al-Shara, formerly al-Jilani, again, from a jihadist who was involved with al-Qaeda. But if you read what, HTS's press releases these days, they're not talking like al-Qaeda, right? They're not talking about we're about to go wage war with the West and install a caliphate or anything like that. Their pitch is we want to create a moderate Islamic liberal democracy, right? There's some tension in that whole package, but that's the pitch. And that's part of how they were able to get all these other groups on board, including various religious and ethnic minorities, is that they were not promising an ethno state that was their ethnic group. They were not promising a religious theocracy that was going to crack down on all alternative religions and sects. They were saying we're guided by Islamic principles, but, minorities, you're free to practice your religion. they are not mandating, headscarves or other kinds of body coverings for women, um, at least officially, right? And that big ideological moderation has been, what they've used to get all these other groups on board. And like, I don't know, maybe they'll be able to make that pitch to some of these larger groups as well.
I mean, that goes back to this broadening of the selectorate idea, right? It's sort of tied into that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the political economy, the lexicon of the political economy of this concept. You talked about that these ideas, they sort of go by the name of selectorate theory. Sometimes, we mentioned the idea that Syria might have been called a narco state. We hear about petro states. You just said ethno state, but that's a little bit different because we're not necessarily thinking, people don't usually think about that in terms of the resources the government has available to them. Another term that we hear is the resource curse. And these are all the same idea. They're all the same idea, which is that the people running the government develop a source of wealth or revenue that is not being delivered on a broad basis by the entire country or something close to the entire country, right? That there's this narrow stream of revenue or wealth. And I wanted to say that these names and this way that Americans, and all three of us are Americans. By the way, Matthew, you up in Montana, by the way?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Got to give a shout out. We have a Montanan on this podcast. I mean, like, how many podcasts get to say that? Not many, because Montana is small. But as Americans, Samantha said something about taking for granted the delivery of services on a broad basis to the population, right? And this these ways of talking about the same concept, like selectorate theory, petrostates, ethnostates, narco states, resource curse. This is all very othering. It's exoticized from the standpoint of Americans. It's like there can't happen here states, right, Samantha? I'm throwing it back to I think episode number 1 with that phrase, right? And I just want to say these concepts are not totally different from just simply the idea that the people running the government have access to some huge pile of wealth and that can generate a revenue stream, right? And just want to throw out there that within the last decade, Americans have very blithely allowed their government to become completely corrupt. And there's a gentleman who I think a lot of people are familiar with by the name of Elon Musk, who is just sitting on basically $500 billion of financial assets. This is not different than sitting on a huge reserve of oil. This is not different than sitting on massive gold mines and just some resource that you can constantly tap for a bunch of resources, right? Now, is $500 billion enough to independently run the U.S. government? I don't know, but it's a pretty big lever. It's a pretty big lever. We marvel at, I think, the ability of what, it seems like the amount of money spent on the recent presidential election is not a huge amount with regard to, compared to the entire U.S. economy or whatever. And yet it seems to have been able to swing things, something about this focused deployment of a pretty good chunk of money seems to have a lot of leverage, right? And so, I don't know, when you just sort of like turn a blind eye to the concept of corruption and just say, we have a different spin on these things in this country, right? We see it in other countries and we say, oh, it's the resource curse. Look at that petro state. Look at that narco state. And in this country, we say, oh, that guy has $500 billion. He's not beholden to anyone, right? Like there's a difference between the rich guy. Here, you don't want to be beholden to certain interests. And in the other countries, we're like, oh, isn't it good to be responsive to the people, right? And here, being rich means you escape being beholden to special interests, right? And that may just be that we're at different points in history in these different countries. And so we look at things differently. But it's two sides of the same coin, I would say.
Yeah, I think that question of selectorate is very broad versus narrow base of support or of like to whom you respond. I think that you see that sort of. I think that seems like a global concept, right? Just talking about political economy generally. Do you respond to a relatively narrow and you need to respond to relatively narrow margins. And then when does that shift, right? Given the opportunity, the selectorate immediately, I mean, in early December, it turned out the selectorate in Syria was everybody, right? You needed everybody, all hands on deck to master this, and you actually didn't have a society like.
No, I think you're absolutely right that these concepts they're very much not meant just to apply to foreign countries, but are useful for analyzing the political economy generally. So one application I happen to like is trying to understand why governance in deep blue states is often very dysfunctional. And the answer has to do with what's your selectorate. Well, your selectorate is the primary voters, right? If you're a politician and if you have a D next to your name, you're always going to win the general election. And to get to the general election, well, you have to win a primary election with 1/10 the total voter, the general election's voters in it. Then like all you really need to do is focus on winning over the most committed Democrats. Very much the same thing applies to deep red states, for example. And so, yeah, you can absolutely see how this theory can be very broadly applied to also understand dysfunctions in America.
And the way that you don't necessarily see the dysfunction until it's a crisis, right? And then you realize, oh, we actually have been responding to everybody, and we have a large portion of the country that is at best doesn't see the difference between one government and another, right? Our pitch is only working as long as we're on top, and then when somebody else promises a better solution, people will go that way because we haven't really delivered much.
I apologize for derailing our discussion of Syria into focusing back on our country, the United States of America. I do want to throw it back to Syria here as we start to wrap up. What's the future hold for HTS? Can they do this? Can they pull Syria together and bring a real, lasting end to this conflict? And, what's the future hold for them?
I think it's really anyone's, it's anyone's guess. I mean, just as anyone making predictions about Syria in mid-November.
Yeah, but that's the job. That's the job, Matthew. You got to.
I think you're making conditional statements. For example, why was Assad so dependent on the drug trade? One reason was because, sanctions and unfriendly relations with most of his neighbors and with the U.S. really cut off his other economic options, right? So I think one question is, does HTS rebuild its diplomatic and thus its economic position? Does it get the ability to trade and to accept aid and rebuilding help from other countries? And part of that is going to be, to what extent can they moderate and look like a good investment opportunity? Part of that, I think, also comes down to, what does the U.S. do? Does the U.S. say, like, well, this is a guy on our terror list, right? We're not going to deal with him, or does the U.S. kind of open the door there? And I think that is really anyone's a pretty open question right now. How does the U.S. respond? Does this create a situation where there's sort of a reset with Syria, or is the new government going to face the same economic challenges, at least regarding sanctions and unfriendly neighbors that the previous one had?
Yeah, so I think that there are kind of like this question of the future. There's the question of what's going to happen inside of Syria, right? Can HTS land the plane, right? Can they actually deliver good government to all of Syria? Can they deliver both, a degree of Islamic government for their core supporters, but also a liberal government for everybody, right? That those two things can be in tension, as many other kinds of religions and liberal democracy, a Christian democracy can be a little bit of tension there, right? But, maybe they'll pull it off, maybe they won't. Certainly there's already been low-level sectarian violence that's happened here and there, but, nothing on the level of like state-sponsored, we are rounding up these people and we're executing them by the hundreds of thousands, like Assad was engaged in. As you say, at the same time, their ability to become like a productive, prosperous society depends on the reactions of their much larger and more powerful neighbors, right? Who, are they willing to readmit them to the international order where you can make a living from trade and deliver a prosperous economy? My own take here is like you say, we have to hold the door open. Right. You don't get a lot of chances like this. and you can't shut the door on them. And like, yeah, maybe we open the door and it all goes to shit and things don't work out in Syria after all. But like, if that's true, then like shutting the door it wouldn't matter what we did. They were always gonna screw it up, right? But if they actually are on a good track and we shut that down through, out of fear or out of old habits, that's just an enormous historical wasted opportunity and a catastrophe for the people of Syria. So I absolutely think we should go into this, not with the certain knowledge that things are going to turn out well in Syria, but with the hope that people there can choose a better way forward than what they've experienced for the last 10 years.
Last 50 years, really. I mean, if we're being honest, we were hoping that we have something there that is more responsive than the 2 generations of Assad dictatorship, right? And that's, even if it's not going to be probably what we hope, or even probably what was hoped in 2011, right? There was a lot of really optimistic, like, a new secular democratic state that has all these ideals. I think that's been pushed somewhat in the future just because so much of the country is wrecked, and ultimately the force that is most responsible for eliminating Assad is not necessarily right. It's not a secular liberal, but if there can be progress made, I think it's not only for the benefit of Syrians, but as a real example of post-conflict, post-dictatorial civil society rebuilding. And so, to some extent, you have to say, like, well, any win here is a big one, because it's such a difficult task to rebuild after a conflict of this high level of destruction and animosity.
All right, Matthew Downhour, thank you for being on. Great stuff. Samantha and I will be back next week, and the world will keep churning forward, and we'll keep trying to make sense of it here on Neon Liberalism.
All right, thanks so much, Jason and Samantha. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Matt.